Daenerys Targaryen walks into a Starbucks where she places her customary secret beverage recipe order for her special coffee, the Fire and Blood, an extra hot black coffee with several splashes of red hot sauce topped off with cayenne pepper. She places her order and waits patiently but briefly because for her, even on the most crowded of days, it never takes long for her drink to be called. The barista prepares the drink, picks up the cup, and reads, Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, the first of her name, the unburnt, the Queen of Meereen, Queen of the Andals and the Rhynar and the First Men, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Breaker of Chains, and Mother of Dragons. Your fire and blood is ready. This meme and the scenario suggest the ways in which the Game of Thrones is a generative text, one that harnesses the energy of Martin's fictional universe to create new fictions, to tell stories that illuminate an aspect of our daily lives. In this way, ordering a drink at Starbucks and having your name called when they read it from the cup is transformed from a mundane or quotidian act into one of personal heraldry. Also, similarly, this shows the ways in which Game of Thrones is a thought-provoking text that prompts us to ask questions, to read critically. So when you think about Daenerys Targaryen in a Starbucks, the questions that come to mind include, is she really the mother of dragons? Or will those dragons usurp her in the end? Is she truly a liberator? And what are the people she has sacrificed along the road to do so? Or is she merely creating different shackles on her path to freedom? Or perhaps the thought of Daenerys Targaryen in a Starbucks prompts a more visceral, less scholarly reaction, one along the lines of, oh shit, she has dragons, run. This meme and the scenario that circulates around it suggests why I believe the Game of Thrones books and the television series from HBO provides a ripe context for exploration in the university classroom. I suggest that it prompts us to read carefully and to read well. It causes us to think. It forces us to react, and in different ways. This environment, then, becomes a way to have a solid foundation for inquiry in a literary classroom. What my work does is to consider why study Game of Thrones. And that's what I want to talk about today. What aspects of the books and television series can be best shown through the context of a university classroom? What happens when you strip away the recreational reading or the more passive, even binge viewing of the series, and you replace that with the rigorous intellectual labor of an academic classroom? I suggest that several things happen in this direction. First, it makes us think more carefully about how some boundaries get broken and other connections get forged. So one of the boundaries that I think Game of Thrones breaks is the one about genre and conventions. What is the Game of Thrones anyway? Martin has described his work as high fantasy. This is a generic convention with which many of us are familiar. However, I think in addition to that, it suggests the ways that Martin's work is very capacious. That means that it can hold a lot of things at once. So for my reading, I see Game of Thrones as combining the family drama of Empire, the chaotic structure of The Walking Dead, the conspiratorial camaraderie of Breaking Bad, the angst of Mad Men. These are all things that you can find in a novel first published in 1996. And that's when Martin's first work was created. And it's important to think about the boundaries that get broken in it. At the same time, because it's so generative, it's a generative text that allows us to create new things with it, you also get to create connections. And this is something that the Game of Thrones universe has done incredibly well. It creates connections between readers, fans, viewers, artists, scholars, producers, and consumers, all of whom are working through questions on Game of Thrones. It seems to me that Game of Thrones not only inspires active reading, it requires active reading. That the payoff is much more pronounced when you take careful consideration of all that is being laid out before you. So for my mind, Game of Thrones is more than just an unprecedentedly popular television series. It is more than just a robust high fantasy fiction. Both of those things work together to create a captivating context that results in a phenomenon. And it is that phenomenon that is worth careful consideration in an academic classroom. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon are the ways in which the aspects of the textual representation of Game of Thrones and the visual phenomenon of Game of Thrones work together, and how we can read those carefully in a university classroom, which I believe is an ideal environment for that type of inquiry. And we're going to use memes to do this. This slide, I'm not sure if you're able to, for those of you all who cannot see, the question asks, how can you tell if someone has read the books before they've watched the TV shows? And you see this very lovely, well-thumbed book here. Don't worry, they'll tell you. Probably while you're watching, they will tell you. They can't help it, right? What I'm going to argue is that Game of Thrones is a generative text that has a high level of depth, complexity, and scale. It is a huge work, and that because of the ways in which it's so multi-themed and multi-layered, it provides this environment that if you're watching the show, you get really drawn into it. People have said this. People who don't even like fantasy literature have found themselves enamored with Game of Thrones. And I suggest that people are drawn in by the complexity of that visual work. People love the beautiful sets, the costumes, the seductive story streams, the bloody battles, all of these very powerful concepts that we see displayed on screen. That's something that viewers really value and really appreciate. At the same time, I believe that readers have an additional layer of interpretation available to them as book readers. If you've read the books, you have access to information before people who haven't read the book. So it does make for, I can admit, a little bit of smugness. However, there does not need to be a tension between book readers and TV viewers, as this meme kind of suggests. I don't think that there's a war between the two of them, because there's one thing that bridges these two different populations. There's one thing that book readers of Game of Thrones and viewers of Game of Thrones has in common, and they both value close and careful reading. They both value careful analysis and paying attention to that which has been presented to them. And so I'm arguing today that when you bring the two together, the university classroom is a great site for that type of negotiation. Readers have an additional layer, and they're able to bring that layer to the viewing, though that doesn't mean that that's the only way to appreciate what's happening. And in University of Virginia classrooms, we value close, careful reading and serious analysis, and that's what we do in the Game of Thrones class. This is an image of Martin's 5 novels to date. And what you'll see there is the ways in which I will suggest that, as I've tried to suggest so far, close reading is at the heart of literary analysis. It is the basis from which scholars make their assessments and interventions in the larger academic field. As we can see from the images, Martin's work sustains robust critique. And what you see with these tabs, this marked up book looks just like a well-read literary text if anyone's read Joyce, or if you've read Toni Morrison. You are marking your book up this way because this is how the best students read. You identify narrative strands, you document significant and insistent aspects of the work, right? It suggests the ways in which a careful reading and cumulative results can be generated by paying attention. Now, in this case, each tab in these books marks a moment when a character dies. Wow. There's a lot of tabs. There are a lot of tabs. And this image reveals a preponderance of death in Martin's fictional universe, which in turn is the basis for a variety of interpretations and reader expectations that are best explored, I believe, in a university classroom. What we see with these forms is an example of active, careful, and close reading put down in a very colorful form. Active reading also occurs thematically, allowing us to ask hard questions of the text and of its adaptation. And what you see in this meme, this is an adaptation of the Dos Equis Most Interesting Man in the World meme, and he has a tagline which reads, "Stay thirsty, my friends," and he's always doing really clever and fun things like skiing or with no skis or something like, really very powerful, clever person. But the cleverness of the Dos Equis ad campaign dovetails here into a critique of Game of Thrones. In it, we see this image, I'm not sure if you're able to see it, but it says, "I don't always rape, but when I do, I rape like a Dothraki. Stay rapey, my friends," right? And this is a critique of the representation, I believe, of Khal Drogo, who is a warrior king who is transformed from conquering rapist into a loving husband. Now, a lot of the questions that we talk about with this image and what I believe that's trying to be generated in what we see in this meme are questions about rape culture, about colonialism, about the shifting definitions of barbarism, about the trafficking of women to advance culture, and the consequences of narrative shortcuts. These are the kind of questions you can ask when you look at the textual representation of the novel and its visual display on screen. Where's the gap between the two? Active reading of Martin's very generative text makes these important conversations possible. This image is a montage of reaction videos. Reaction videos are a great genre. This is a new thing that is unique, I believe, to Game of Thrones. I wish I could show you some of them, but just imagine everyone being just as shocked as they appear to be in all these images. So this is a montage of reaction videos to the Red Wedding, which, to cue the quickest recap ever, is momentous and shocking. These images were captured by someone who had already read the books and hence knew what was coming. The person that did not know, however, was the person who was watching. So this shows about the ways in which Game of Thrones allows us to straddle the gap between active viewing and passive viewing. Those who knew of the scandalous event from reading the books were transformed from consumers of a fiction into creators of a version of that fiction. And this is important, to transform consumers into producers, that you're not just watching Game of Thrones, that you are also reading it actively, that you have an investment. And this is something that we do explore in class. The photograph reveals the interplay of the books and their television adaptation while stressing the consequences of active reading and active viewing. And what we see here, I believe, is a great example of the ways in which Game of Thrones is a phenomenon. There are multiple layers of investments from readers, viewers, viewers who become readers, readers who become viewers, who become bloggers or recappers, or fan fiction authors, or graphic novelists, or game designers, or cosplay rollers, or editors of scholarly editions, all of which are devoted to crafting a better understanding of Game of Thrones. So just to close and to kind of like reiterate my final claims, Game of Thrones is a generative text. It's one that crosses the boundaries between genres, between visual and textual interpretations, between readers and viewers, between consumers and producers. The university classroom, I believe, is a vibrant forum to explore these issues. And our challenge, I believe, as a university and as a classroom in this scholarly work, in this scholarly endeavor, is to research, is to ask questions that challenge the text, to ask questions that challenge its adaptation, to ask questions that challenge its place in popular culture, to ask questions that challenge each other, and to ask questions that challenge ourselves. Thank you.